James Acaster is easily the strangest comedian on the planet. He has the swagger of an arrogant penguin and the style of a hipster version of Paddington Bear. You may know him as a meme.
Started making it, had a breakdown. Bon appetit.
Or for his various appearances on panel shows.
Well, I wasn't going to get the present I wanted.
Which was? What did you want?
The Spice Girls' debut album, Spice.
It's a lie.
He's also one of the smartest comedians working today. Acaster's 4-part Repertoire series pushes stand-up in a really interesting direction. He creates comedy that has a clear structure and narrative, amounting to something way more than a series of standalone jokes. So, how does Acaster do this, and why can't other comedians do the same?
Yeah.
But what do I mean when I talk about the structure of comedy? Well, there isn't one. Most comedians will come on stage, tell a bunch of random jokes in no particular order, end on their funniest joke, and leave. There's no narrative, no sense of progression, no anything. The closest we've got is a callback, which, while being a clever trick, is more a signal to the audience that the show is over, as opposed to anything with actual meaning.
We'll repeat the phrase carpet remnant world over some music, and that will give the illusion of structure.
No comedians are thinking of stand-up as a show instead of a series of standalone jokes, which I think is because so much of comedy works in the moment. Comedians want things to feel natural and spontaneous, to give us the impression that we're listening to a free-flowing conversation rather than a carefully calculated routine. This is why Dave Chappelle slaps the mic on his knee, why Michael McIntyre laughs at his own jokes, why Bill Burr forgets who he's talking about.
Right, that older woman there that makes the cookies on,
Structure is the enemy of pretty much every comedian. It breaks the illusion. Instead of some hilarious stream of consciousness, the comedian suddenly feels rehearsed and scripted. The more structure a comedian has, the more fake the comedian feels. Hasan Minhaj's 2017 special Homecoming King is a good example of stand-up that rides this line. Technically it's stand-up, but everything feels too neat and clean. The big screen and camera cues take away from Hasan's spontaneity. Instead of stand-up, it feels more like theatre, or a well-rehearsed TED Talk. And nobody wants that. When it comes to structure, most comedians simply won't bother. The risk-to-reward ratio is simply too high, which makes sense, but it's also a pity because there's a lot of narrative and thematic depth that comedians are missing out on. So what does Acaster do differently? How does he give his comedy structure without making it feel rehearsed? The answer lies in Acaster's stage persona. Most comedians want to appear on stage like a natural extension of who they are in real life. Sure, they might exaggerate a few personality traits here and there, but fundamentally they want to seem like a realistic and believable version of themselves. You can tell this by the way most comedians start their shows. Most comedians will start a show by wandering on stage, thanking the audience before sneakily segueing into their material. Louis C.K. was a king at this. He'd wander on stage in his black shirt and sneakers, start talking about some random thing, and before you knew it, he was blindsiding you with punchlines.
If you have something you want to say to me, totally, this is what we do. We write it down, and then you go outside in the lobby, and then you go home and you kill yourself. Because that's selfish. This is a rhetorical performance. It's got nothing to do with you.
Then there's James Acaster. Acaster looks at believability and runs in the other direction. Watching his stand-up feels like observing an alien life form that you can see but never quite understand. This is obvious from the get-go. Instead of segueing into his material, Acaster purposefully throws the audience off balance. In episode 1, he performs the first 10 minutes on his knees. In episode 2, he starts the show in blackout. In episode 4, he comes on stage in the middle of a monologue.
Productive as you can be on any given day, obviously anyone does, but it's hard not to beat yourself up, you know?
This achieves two things. Firstly, it challenges the audience's expectations. We're immediately wondering what on earth he's doing, and Acaster uses this curiosity to hook us into his material. Secondly, and more importantly, Acaster makes it pretty clear from the start that what he's doing is a show, and the person he's portraying is, to some degree, a character. Unlike other comedians who are always trying to maintain the illusion of believability, Acaster is purposefully ridiculous, and it's this sense of distance which enables him to use a much wider variety of techniques to break up his shows. He can play podcasts, show Google signs, and talk about his duck research in all its glorious detail. If any other comedian paused mid-show to do a 90-second musical mime about passport photos, they would be booed off stage. Yet, because Acaster is playing such a heightened version of himself, you just kind of go along with it. It seems like something his character would do. In this way, Acaster is playing a persona, a character that may share many of Acaster's experiences, but also has a completely separate identity. Yet, as the shows progress, Acaster begins to blur the lines between who he is on stage and who he is in real life. In fact, it's not always clear who we're listening to. Is he telling us the truth, or is he making stuff up? Or is it somewhere in between? It's this arm wrestle between who Acaster actually is and the character he's pretending to be that ultimately gives his comedy its meaning and structure. In terms of understanding the mechanics of comedy, Acaster is a genius. Each of the 4 episodes in his Repertoire series stand up not only individually, but also as a collective. Everything weaves and loops together. Episode 3 begins with Acaster fixing the stage after his breakdown in episode 2. Episode 4 ends with Acaster walking off stage only to reappear at the start of episode 1. Callbacks span across multiple episodes. In episode 1 he sets up a callback that isn't repaid until episode 3. Episode 4 is built around understanding the callbacks laid out in the previous episodes. Acaster even cited Star Wars Rogue One as an inspiration for making something that links and connects together. However, the best way to understand exactly what Acaster is doing is to focus on episodes individually. Acaster will generally structure his specials around a story that's completely made up. In episode 1 he's an undercover cop, in episode 2 he's on jury duty, in episode 3 he goes into witness protection after a fraudulent honey scam.
We have places your family can hide in peace and security. Cape Fear, Terror Lake, New Horror Field, Screamville.
Ooh, Ice Creamville.
No, Screamville.
But as the specials continue, you start to realize that Acaster is using these stories almost like a kind of prism to explore his real thoughts and feelings. As Acaster says, I'm almost able to be more honest by lying. By making everything up, I'm able to say what I really want to. This is most obvious in episode 1, where Acaster completely breaks character to explain how he was using his story about being an undercover cop to actually address a post-breakup identity crisis.
I'm an undercover cop pretending to be a stand-up comedian. The only thing lamer than that would be a stand-up comedian pretending to be an undercover cop. Imagine that loser. But he's not that guy, going on stage night after night, using the whole undercover cop thing as a way of talking about his own personal problems he's been having this year. And he thinks he's being all smart, disguising it in the subtext. But there's this bit right at the end of the show where it becomes painfully obvious what's happened to him this year.
The structure of Acaster's 3 other specials are not as obvious. we'll focus on episode 2, Represent. Acaster uses the fictional tale about being called up for jury service to ultimately explore his flailing religious faith. Acaster starts the show in blackout, posing a funny but ultimately nihilistic question.
The universe began with the Big Bang. But what came before that?
Acaster then quickly moves on, yet as the show progresses, these existential doubts still seem to be playing at the back of Acaster's mind. An innocent joke about fortune cookies segues into Acaster's mortality.
Every hour of your life. Now you're never getting back. They're gone forever. Time is not refundable. Death is the end.
An observational sequence about a back massage is completely railroaded by Acaster's existential despair.
Isn't that just your whole life? There's no more jobs and jobs on a constant loop, till eventually one day, permanently no more jobs forever. To stretch it into the distance and really missing jobs at that point, isn't it? You really miss jobs when it's no more jobs forever. Too much of a good thing, the old death.
Acaster is able to establish a theme in a way that's not immediately noticeable. By continually interrupting his otherwise absurd train of thought, we begin to see what the real James Acaster is thinking beneath his onstage disguise. This is made clear when Acaster tells the story of going to a Christingle service with the jury. Here, Acaster brings both sides of his personality together. His ridiculous tale about jury service comes into direct contact with his genuine existential doubts.
We sat at the side of the church in 2 rows of 6, force of habit. As a little kid, I used to go to those Christingle services all the time. It brought all those feelings back of being a little Christian boy. So much doubt. And I'd stare at the ceiling and I'd think, what came before the Big Bang? What came before God? What came before that? What came before that? What came before that?
Acaster repeats the question he laid out in Blackout, taking his genuine fears and integrating them into the fiction of the show. This comes to a climax when Acaster abandons jury duty for a dentist appointment, where his crisis of confidence manifests into a complete mental breakdown.
Question 1 on a dental questionnaire. On a scale of 1 to 10, how happy are you with your smile? How happy are you with your smile? With your smile.
With the existential doubts he had as a child, Acaster takes this seemingly simple question and begins to overanalyze and overthink. He starts nervously pacing the stage, shifting pieces of the set around.
You feeling happy? Yeah, sure am. You smiling? Yep. How's that make you feel? What?
This breakdown is best summarized when Acaster describes a cartoon tooth. A seemingly innocent symbol of dental hygiene instead becomes a looping, paradoxical nightmare.
There's a poster on the wall of a cartoon tooth. And the tooth had a face, and the tooth was smiling, and the tooth had teeth. What's up if you have a horror film? There were kids in there. Do the tooth's teeth have teeth too? Do the tooth's teeth have teeth too?
The more questions Acaster asks, the more hopeless he becomes, until his existential doubts literally dismantle everything around him. He flips his stool, pointlessly turns the mic stand, and unplugs his microphone, metaphorically breaking his world apart. Or as Acaster says,
when you're a little Christian boy, everything's nice. It's exactly where it should be and it makes sense. When you grow up, it should get easier, but it gets harder, you get more scared and more doubtful, and then you end up just moving everything around, taking it apart and throwing a giant strop.
Acaster then ends his specials almost like a kind of magic trick, where he brings all the disparate elements of his show together through a series of callbacks. His comment about fortune cookies,
well, that's 3 hours of my life I'm not getting back.
now takes on a greater meaning.
There you go. There's an hour of your life not getting back.
His ludicrous routine about the Chilean miners.
Good to see we've got some proper Chilean miners fans in tonight, by the way. That doesn't always happen, actually. Hardcore fans, am I right? Since before they got stuck.
Now finds Acaster trying to grasp onto whatever small truth he can find.
I like Chilean miners. I watched it on the news. I know for a fact that all of it happened, and it had a happy ending. I like that. I don't like any of this. This is shit.
The genius of Acaster's comedy is that you only realise how cleverly it's assembled in these closing moments. It's only when Acaster connects all the dots together that you realise everything had a place and a purpose. Acaster knew what he was doing all along. Acaster therefore gives his comedy structure without ever undermining what he's doing in the moment. He maintains the illusion of spontaneity while also creating comedy that has a narrative and a purpose. The final image of Acaster walking with the Christingle finds him re-engaging with the childhood tradition that gave him so much joy. Where before Acaster used the Christingle as the butt of a joke, here he engages with it authentically. As a result, we see Acaster calling back to a time before he was filled with doubt and anxiety, when he could eat his Christingle in peace without wondering what it all meant. When the world, in its own little way, had order. Blowing the candle out takes us back to the blackout at the start of the show. Some things just aren't meant to last. James Acaster may have the aura of a passive-aggressive piece of knitwear come to life, but simply labelling him as strange or eccentric is a disservice to his brilliance as a comedian. His ability to blend the ridiculous with the real, to use a stage persona to explore his deeper thoughts and feelings, puts him miles ahead of almost every other comedian. He is able to step back and see how his material connects together, giving his comedy real structure and meaning, while still making it funny. And that, well, that counts for a lot.
Spat! You need us for the wedding, Jew. You need us for the wedding, Jew. You need us, Jew. You need us, Mum. Help us. Spaghetti bolognese, I'll say it.